Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Wednesday, everybody. Today's episode is coming to you from beautiful New Zealand, where I will be based for the next few weeks. We begin today's episode with EU-China relations. On Monday, European Commission Executive Vice President Dombrovskis and Vice Premier of the State Council, He Lifeng, co-chaired the 10th EU-China High-Level Economic and Trade Dialogue, a main platform for the EU and China to discuss economic and financial matters, as well as trade and investment cooperation. We remember before the meeting, the EU trade chief made a speech critical of China at the Bund summit in Shanghai, signaling his intent for a more adversarial relationship with China on the trade front, but while still committed to engagement, expressing, quote, "The EU needs to protect itself in situations when its openness is abused. It involves gaining a deeper and exact understanding of the key risks that we face and acting accordingly. To de-risk. Let me stress, de-risking is not decoupling, and the EU has no intention of decoupling from China." End quote. In the high-level economic and trade dialogue, the two sides discussed the macroeconomic situation in the EU, China, and globally. Dombrovskis emphasized in particular the impact of Russia's attack on Ukraine on global economic growth prospects as well as on food and energy security. According to Chinese state media, He, who is also a member of the Politburo, expressed that, quote, "China stands ready to work with the EU to fully implement the important consensus reached by the leaders of the two sides, consolidate cooperation in traditional areas, actively explore new areas of cooperation, jointly address global challenges, and take the China-EU comprehensive strategic partnership to a new level." End quote. State-run Xinhua called the talks, quote, "pragmatic, candid, and productive." End quote. However, these meetings come hot on the heels of the EU Commission announcing anti-subsidy tariffs on Chinese EV makers, a massive strategic industry for Beijing. On Tuesday, Dombrovskis said that there was, quote, "sufficient prima facie evidence," end quote, to justify the probe into imports from China of battery-powered vehicles, adding, quote, "strictly speaking, it's not only to Chinese electric vehicle brands, it can also be other producers' vehicles if they are receiving production-side subsidies." End quote. US-based Bloomberg reports this week that the European Union's new, tougher approach to China is being shaped by French concerns that Beijing's trade practices have started to pose a critical threat to core industries. The government in Paris, the outlet writes, has taken a key role in driving the policy shift, quote, "calculating that inaction now would put the bloc's economy on a path to long-term damage," end quote. Unnamed officials expressed to the outlet that what happened with the solar industry a decade ago is still fresh in the memory, quote, "with cheap imports from China gutting European production." One of the officials said Europe's auto industry could potentially be vulnerable in the same way, and so the EU faces a binary choice. Either it affirms its power or submits to China. End quote. US-based Politico writes this week that EU officials may also be looking into the sensitive medical technology sector, which Brussels argues it has opened its markets further than China has, as well as a probe into the railroad industry, quote, "which is effectively closed to European train makers and technology providers," end quote. And UK-based Reuters reports that Germany will no longer grant promotional loans to China from 2026, quote, "in the latest measure to reduce Germany's strategic dependence on China," end quote, with the German Federal Development Ministry expressing this week, quote, "we are no longer treating China as a developing country," end quote. Next up, Philippine-China tensions continue to flare up in the South China Sea. This is an ongoing development which we've been following for several months now. The latest development is that, at the direction of the Philippines president, the Philippine Coast Guard has removed a marine barrier which the PRC had placed at Scarborough Shoal, with a government statement expressing, quote, "The barrier posed a hazard to navigation, a clear violation of international law. It also hinders the conduct of fishing and livelihood activities of Filipino fisher folk in the region, which is an internal part of the Philippine national territory." End quote. The action, unsurprisingly, has angered Beijing, with a foreign ministry spokesperson expressing this week that the area, quote, "has always been China's territory." End quote. What is notable is that the recent shift by the Philippines to showing much more video of what the PRC is doing in these areas and bringing Western journalists to watch these operations is greatly angering Beijing too. Quote, "The Philippine government vessels carrying journalists from Western countries equipped with cameras and other equipment for on-site filming also came to the waters. This has exposed a new trend in the South China Sea that should alert all parties. The strengthening of the Philippines' domestic radical forces in alliance with external powers on the South China Sea issue. They have put considerable effort into creating public opinion and internationally engaging in a media war." End quote. And in a separate article, the same outlet writes, quote, "Chinese experts said that the reemergence of frictions between China and the Philippines are obviously driven by U.S. instigation. If Manila continues to follow the U.S.'s instructions to repeat the wrong approach of confronting China on the South China Sea issue, it would be extremely unwise and unfortunate." End quote. Meanwhile, the United States, Japan, and the Philippines have published a joint statement on these tensions, expressing, quote, "The three countries will continue to call out behavior that is inconsistent with international law, including the People's Republic of China's recent actions near Second Thomas Shoal that interfered with the Philippines' lawful exercise of high seas freedom of navigation." End quote. Next up, Martin Wolf on China's economy. If you're enjoying today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing are all helps for the channel. And for anyone who can go that extra mile and help me keep China Update financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. This is a lot of work, but all your support are all incredible sources of motivation. So thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Next up, chief economics commentator at UK-based The Financial Times, Martin Wolf, has published a thought-provoking opinion piece titled "How China Can Avoid the Japan Trap." The piece touches on many familiar themes, with some contrarian takes. We end today's video by examining some of Wolf's points, which we are now quoting selected excerpts of directly. Excess savings play a central part in the story of Japan's fall from economic grace. Germany's excess savings played a central role in the Eurozone crisis. China's story is similar, but on a bigger scale. Its gross national savings peaked at 52% of GDP in 2008. It was still at 44% in 2019, before COVID hit. Prior to 2008, nearly a fifth of these huge savings went into China's current account surplus. After the crisis, such surpluses became politically and economically unacceptable. The alternative turned out to be even higher investment, much of it into property. Gross investment rose from 40 to 46% of GDP from 2007 to 2012. Yet this rise in investment coincided with a marked fall in the growth rate. This combination can be indicated by changes in the incremental capital output ratio, the ratio of the investment to the growth rate. This rose substantially, from a low of 3 in 2007 to a pre-COVID peak of 7 in 2019. This indicates a marked fall in the return on investments. Meanwhile, the debt ratio soared, adding financial fragility to the picture. As long ago as 2007, Wen Jiabao, then premier, warned that the Chinese economy was unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. Michael Pettis of Peking University's Guanghua School of Management has made the same argument in detail on multiple occasions, which we have examined before on China Update. It is impossible to know when unsustainable processes will come to an end. It looks as though the unbalanced economy is now being stopped by a mighty property crash. The danger is not one of a huge financial crisis. The danger is rather one of chronically weak demand. It will be impossible in today's global environment to generate either a huge export boom or consistent current account surpluses. The investment rate is already spectacularly high, while growth is slowing. The basic reality of the Chinese economy is that household consumption is only around 40% of GDP. During the earlier hyper-growth period, this worked well, but now the savings are far greater than can be productively used. Income now needs to accrue to those who will spend it. This would generate higher growth of consumption in the medium term and higher levels of consumption in the long run, so providing a solid basis of domestic demand for future expansion. But this will require redistribution of income and assets towards ordinary people together with a marked shift in the focus of public spending. It will also demand an early restructuring of outstanding debts. This looks like a decisive moment in China's modern economic history. If the government recognizes that the old high-saving, high-investment model is broken, it can generate reasonable growth with a more balanced consumer-led economy. But this would take revolutionary changes in income distribution and the priorities of government. This would be good for China. It can avoid the Japan trap. But will it? Here ends the direct quote and today's video. Thank you so much everybody for watching today's episode of China Update. Have a wonderful Wednesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.